Styled as Archipenko, I invite you to visit the exhibition Dona Archipenko with me. Here we see a dialogue between artists and different artistic movements. Marthe Donas and Alexander Archipenko, they are connected to multiple artistic circles and figures of their time, which is visible in this constellation of influences. Among them are Mikhail Larionov, Natalia Goncharova, brothers Duchamp, and other artists who shaped the art of the future. The exhibition, the Golden Section, refers to a broader search for harmony, structure, and rhythm, central for modern art. In the first room, we meet Marthe Donas and Alexander Archipenko before they knew each other. Already we can see that the shapes that we call cubism nowadays is interesting for these artists. Marthe Donas was born in Antwerp and went to the art academy in Antwerp. Because of the First World War, the family moved to the Netherlands, and later, together with her sister, they moved to Ireland. She followed stained glass in Dublin, and these influences we see later in her works. After a couple of years, Marthe Donas decided to continue her artistic path in Paris. There she studied at Andrea Lotto. This work looks almost like a religious painting or even an icon, and here we see already a connection to Alexander Archipenko. His grandfather was an icon painter. Once during an illness, when Alexander had to stay in bed, his grandfather bought him a book about Renaissance artists. Archipenko's father worked at Kiev University, where so-called Scythian stone figures were displayed. It is very likely that exactly these figures inspired him to create this sculpture of woman with a cat. Alexander Archipenko studied at the art schools in Kiev, in Moscow, and even tried in Paris, but he was always disappointed in this classical approach. That's why he decides to go to the Louvre to study ancient art by himself. And we clearly see that the inspiration of the ancient art shaped his sculptures. In 1917, Alexander Archipenko and Marthe Donas are both in Nice. Finally, they meet each other and understand how much they inspire each other. Here we can focus, actually in most of his works we can see the principle of negative space, but here we can see it more clearly. In this sculpture, the face of the woman is absent, but very clearly perceptible. Form is created through its absence. On this exhibition, you clearly see mutual inspirations of two artists, similar colors, forms, and compositions. Unfortunately, the large version of this work has not survived, The Woman with the Mirror. The big version contained an actual mirror. He placed even his photograph instead of signing it. Here are three works of Marthe Donas created in non-rectangular formats. Shaped paintings. We use this term today to describe American art of the 60s, for example, Frank Stella. But we see here clearly that these experiments emerged much earlier. Also, she incorporates texture and textile, allowing materiality to shape the image itself. Today, we would call it mixed media. Marthe Donas remains on the surface. She's a painter. Archipenko, by contrast, goes further, developing what he called himself archi-painter, but this term was a bit difficult and didn't stay in the history, so instead we call it sculptor paintings, where sculpture and painting merge together. In his creations, he followed the material, and material dictated the form. Very interesting to see sketches next to the finished painting. Unfortunately, Marthe Donas herself disliked this painting later, and she painted it gray. On the other side, she painted a new work. Only later, restoration discovered the work behind the gray layer. The theme of movement and dance is very central for Cubofuturism. The performance was already important for Dada movement. They combined theater theater, dance, visual art, Marthe Donas abstracts her work much more and creates this work tango. It was so interesting that they used it for the poster of Der Sturm exhibition in Berlin. The dance by Alexander Archipenko shows two figures in dynamic interaction. You have to look around this sculpture to see multiple angles to understand how negative space and mass create movement and composition. Here is the blue dancer, but it's not blue, you might say. Archipenko often worked with plaster, applying color on its surface. Later, he painted every version of the same sculpture differently. And the first version of this sculpture originally was painted blue, and later version, as you see, is red, but the original title remains. The other work, Dance by Marthe Donas, was rediscovered during the preparation of this exhibition. It was found in a Japanese museum collection. Here we find a very nice dialogue created by curators. Marthe Donas constructs an almost pedagogical sequence of how to get to abstraction. So the first work was created in Dublin, like we can see in the left corner. Later, she experiments with abstraction, and the two final works we see how abstraction reaches the new level. At the same time, in his early period, Alexander Archipenko creates a comparable work, also a nude figure. This room shows also a broader cultural context of the time. Three huge schools, Russian avant-garde, Bauhaus and the style, shaped not only visual culture, but they were focused, they researched how to design the way of life of society. Donas knew Mondrian and Duisburg personally. They are the core of the style movement. She also created geometrical abstractions, but she understands that this abstraction is not for her. There is not sensitivity she prefers. We can also assume that maybe that's why their paths with Alexander Archipenko diverged. While Archipenko pursued maximum abstraction of form, Marthe Donas chooses a direction in which figuration is still perceptible. The exhibition introduces another artistic couple, Natalia Goncharova and Ihor Larionov. They lived and worked together throughout their lives. Although many believe they didn't produce significant art after immigration, but we know that they created multiple stage designs and costumes for Sergei Diaghilev Russian ballet. They have also another exhibition on the view in the museum about René Magritte. An attentive museum guard noticed an intriguing detail in this work by Leopold Sauvage. By observing its elements closely, you can clearly see where Magritte found his inspiration. In the 20s, the paths of Marthe Donas and Alexander Archipenko finally diverged. Marthe Donas married and moved to the Belgian countryside. Alexander Archipenko married in Berlin and immigrated to the United States. Although their lives took different directions, their art remains grounded to the shared foundations, and these shared foundations were formed during their years of collaboration. In the final room, both adults and children are invited to create their own work. Using forms from the artworks by Marthe Donas and Alexander Archipenko, visitors can assemble their own constructions and create new work.